Good morning to all of you. Sai Ram, and humble pranams in the lotus feet of Bhagavan. I am today experiencing a mood which I must say I've never experienced before. It's basically, I'm asking myself the question, what on earth am I doing here trying to talk to you? And the reason for the question that I'm asking myself are the songs we heard just before I came on stage. It says everything that I've been struggling to say yesterday and I'm trying to say today. It was said so well. I feel I am not really required, and it's a redundant presence. Nevertheless, as you say, in this part of the world, the show must go on, and more or less in that spirit, and with much humility, I would like to start my talk today with the title slide, which is the first slide. How humans lost their way. That includes me too. So we have to find out. Now, let us start with a baby that has just come into the world, because, you know, it's the baby that eventually gets lost when it grows up. So the next slide shows the baby. Oh, there it is. When I first saw this picture, it stunned me because I knew I wanted a picture like this. I searched for it and I got it. This baby has just come. It's too young to even know who its mom is. And yet it is so happy. So I asked myself, what happened? Has it heard some news that its grandmother has left it $1 million or something like that? Not really. The face you see is the face of bliss. If you want to know bliss, just see that. Now, how come the baby who doesn't even know its mom know what bliss is, and yet it's experiencing it? I mean, that's proof. That is because, remember what Swami says about bliss. Bliss is happiness, is union with God. Ananda is union with God. This baby has just come from God, and is still in communication. The lines have not started cracking up. And it knows, and it is experiencing happiness before it is able to even recognize its mom. And that's a very important point. Okay, what happens when the baby starts growing up? All this may be old hat to the moms here and also to the dads, but some of you are so old you might have forgotten. So let me remind you. Next slide, please. So the baby becomes curious. And it's looking everywhere. Actually, in the process, it thinks happiness is found maybe in the PC and flowers. This was before the cell phone was invented. And now, of course, it's smartphones. It says, I want nothing less than a smartphone. Personally believe that God will get tired of all this and He will introduce a new gene so that it automatically, when it's born, it comes with its own cell phone. I don't know what brand it will be, but I'm sure it will come with a cell phone. Okay, but thus, pretty soon, curiosity leads it to acquire toys, you know, and we help by giving toys. And once it gets toys, see what happens. See, they're fighting over toys. So the first sign of attachment and the consequences of attachment become evident. So the point is, when there is attachment, you get into problems. And the problems are symbolized with the next slide. This is the story of the two wolves that we heard. Incidentally, when I was hearing that story, I recall a recording that Samuel Sandwich sent me many years ago. It was a recording with a rabbi, and he narrated the same story. So this story has a Jewish ancestry also, apparently it looks. And the story, as was narrated this morning by a wonderful master seminarist, I heard it on the radio in NPR. And in fact, narrated the story in Caltech, where I had to give a talk just before the retreat. So he said, this story is widespread, but who is absorbing the lesson? But I would like to mention that this story was interpreted in the BBC by an imam in a very original way many years ago. The BBC has religious programs, and I listened to it. He said, the word jihad is totally misinterpreted by people. He was a scholar of Islam, and he was an imam also. He said, jihad means fighting the non-believer. And the non-believer is the devil. It's the devil who does not believe in Allah, and that devil is in the mind. So jihad is really a fight inside the mind to purify the mind. It's not going and killing people outside. It is a distortion created by an extremist group with its own agenda. But sadly, that is not widely known, and people make all kinds of wrong associations between religious beliefs and certain groups, and out comes a lot of problems. So this is really jihad, getting rid of the evil in mind. And that idea is present in all faiths. Swami has always talked about, cleansing the mind. What is the meaning of cleansing the mind? Starving the bad wolf. And Swami says, starve your desires. When you starve the desires, they will go away. He gives a simple example. A dog comes, stray dog comes, and you welcome it with biscuits and all that. Then becomes a pest, it refuses to go. And this guy tries everything, nothing. The dog is still hanging around. And Swami says, then somebody tells him, don't feed it biscuits. So dog wags its tail, falls, rolls over, does all the stunts, nothing, no biscuits. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. The dog gets fed up and leaves. Starve your desires and you're through. That's what he says. So now, keeping this in mind, we go to the next slide, which is a repeat of what I said earlier. We are here, caught up in desires and all that. One way is to go into transcendental meditation, but we stay here, and instead of desiring a jaguar or a house on the beach or whatever, we desire to serve God. That is feeding the good wolf, not the bad wolf. And then we can quickly go back to where we came from. And this same idea is portrayed in the next slide in a slightly different way. It's like going uphill, because we say, oh, it's so tough to go back to God. Why don't we stay near the beach? It's flat, it's wonderful, and so on and so forth. And this climb, which is symbolic, really means I have to go through all these levels which bind me less and less. Binding is very severe. It's severe here also, but it's less. Still you are bound. And God is free. So if you want to be one with God, if you want to achieve union with God, which is what we want to do, because we want bliss forever and don't have to pay for it, by the way. So you have to go beyond this. You conquer Everest only when you step on the summit. So there is no other stop. You can't stop at Camp 8. This is Camp 8 at the top. That's not it. You got to go there, then they will say you have climbed Everest. But here, you would have reached the house of God, and God is waiting there. When you are coming, it's too late. Something with maybe traffic, Memorial Day traffic, but we have to go there. Now, Swami has given descriptions, 2 alternate descriptions, relating to how we break the bonds of ego. One of them is illustrated in the next slide. This small circle is the individual, the ego self, and this circle, which is supposed to be infinite, is God. So you have one circle inside the other circle. The big circle, which is really infinite, is God. So supposing you take to the path of meditation, yogic meditation. In other words, you follow the yogic path. This is one of the two routes I showed. Then what happens is, the yogi says, I am God, I am God, I am God, as Dick was telling us in all his beautiful songs. And then he grows bigger and bigger. And the chains that bind him get tenser and tenser. And at some stage, the chain breaks. So you break out of bondage just by constantly identifying yourself with God. And that's a tough call. Not all of us can do it. On the other hand, there is another strategy. Next slide, please. Okay. Here is the small circle. Here's the big circle. This is, of course, infinite, and this is God. This is you and me. We are bound by ego. And what we do is, we shrink our ego through service. We shrink our ego through service. And when we bring down our ego, we get cleansed. And once again, you get this bypass to go to God. Swami says, it's like in the other case, the man becomes bigger and bigger, saying, I'm God, and breaks the chain. Here you become thinner and thinner, and you slip out of the chain. The chain doesn't mind you. You become so thin. You can just shake it off and walk away. Chain lies there, and you are free. So both strategies are available, plan A, plan B. For most of us, plan B is better. That's what Krishna says. And Swami says, makes it even simpler. You don't have to do any rituals. See God in all, as Dick said, and serve that God in whatever way that God wants. God wants water, give water. God wants company, and you hear nice stories, talk to him. Because that God may come as a sick person, that God may be a handicapped person, that God may be a poor person. We don't know in what form God comes. You be ready for all and serve him always in your home. And this is not empty philosophy. It has got actually a lot of practical meaning. Because when we go out and serve society, it makes an impact on society. And one of the impacts that we need to make, especially as an organization, starting with our own selves, is to hold our families together. As Swami often said, the family is the building block of society, just as the atom is the building block of everything in the universe. This body is made up of atoms. From atoms come molecules, from molecules come organs, proteins, and then from proteins and stuff like that, we get the whole body. So anything in the universe, you name it, I can break it down into atoms. The atom is the building block of the entire universe, physical universe. The same way, the family is the building block of society. If you don't have families, you cannot put together people and get societies. It is a disjointed, chaotic stuff. The stars, there are no atoms. The atom is torn apart, and you just have nuclei and electrons, and sometimes even the nuclei are torn apart. So it's very hot, it's very chaotic, but it's good for us because we get heat and light. But we don't want a hot society. We want a cool society, an ordered society. And if you want order in physics, you always go down in temperature. That is the law of physics. And the Chinese, there's a good saying in Chinese, which is, the final test of any civilization is, what type of husbands and wives and fathers and mothers does it turn out? So you may have any kind of wealthy society, but is it a good civilization? That question. And the answer to that question is this. Do you have good families? Or do you have broken families? The Dow Jones may cross even 16,000, but if all you have is a lot of broken families, we are not making progress. And besides the austere simplicity of such a question, every achievement of civilization, art, philosophy, literature, material living, pales into insignificance. Because civilization is usually measured in terms of material wealth, achievements in art, and this and that. Okay, those are all hallmarks. But at the end of the day, do you have a good society? And Swami gives a lot of importance to society because he says, if you are God, what is society except a collection of you? That is macro God, this is micro God, and the macro and micro should not have any what you call difference, except one of size. And the first step in that way to macro God is the family. This is only an assembly. You go to a railway station, you see a lot of people. That's an assembly. It breaks off very quickly. People get into the train, and some people get out of the train. But society, a family should not be like that. And unless we have the families coming together to cohere, we can't have a society. And the former Pope, Benedict, says something very nice in one of his encyclical letters. He wrote many of them on many things, one on charity, one on love and all that. He was a philosopher and a scholar, and they are very long. But if you take the trouble to read them, there are lots of very, very good passages in them. And I am quoting one passage in the next slide, which is relevant to the present discussion. He says, without doubt, scientific and technological progress offers possibilities for good, but it also opens up appalling possibilities for evil, possibilities that formerly did not exist. One example is cybercrime. The cybercrime did not exist when I was young, for the simple reason we didn't have computers. Cybercrime emerged after the advent of the computers. That's what he's saying there. Appalling possibilities for evil, possibilities that formerly did not exist. You remember just a few days ago, a syndicate went on emptying ATMs all over the world, and in New York City, in a few hours, they siphoned off $3 million. And the total loot was something like $45 million. Now we have all, the Pope says, we have all witnessed the way in which progress in the wrong hands can become, and has indeed become, a terrifying progress in evil. If technical progress is not matched by corresponding progress in man's ethical formation, in man's inner growth, then it is not progress at all, but a threat for man and for the world. In other words, what I am trying to say is, it's not something that I am making up. These are problems that have been recognized by deep thinkers everywhere. And Swami has been explaining all this to us long before these thinkers became aware. If, for example, you go and read his discourse delivered in 1971, when the Anantapur College was inaugurated, he was already foreseeing the future of India in terms of cheap imitation of Western civilization. And he says, I am starting this college which will be modeled like a Gurukulam of old to foster ancient traditions. 1971, India did not have television at that time. There was an experimental station in Delhi, donated by the Germans, so that Indians become familiar with the technology. It had a very short radius, range, few miles, that's all. But Swami saw all this and he warned us against this. Now, in a sense, this transformation of human society rapidly from values to a stage where we began to abandon values started with the Industrial Revolution, which began in England. The next slide shows the impact of Industrial Revolution. The first thing that came out of the Industrial Revolution was the steam engine. On one side, it helped mechanization of factories. On the other hand, it made travel much easier. The railways came into existence, railroads. Steam engine made it possible for people to travel over long distances without the horse and the buggy, and they could just sit down and go. And at one time, a lot of people could go. And then came the press, printing press. Of course, press existed earlier from Gutenberg's days, but you had a mechanized press, so you could print a lot of material in a short time. And by press, I mean the newspaper, and it not only promoted literacy, but it also produced change in social attitudes. I was very sort of fascinated to read the way the press developed in this country, especially during the time of civil war and subsequently. And it very quickly found its sort of wavelength. It went into what you call bullying, abusing, and all sorts of things. In fact, many people say the press there in those days was far more vitriolic than now. And finally, the advent of manufacture, especially starting with textiles, led to migration of people from the farm to the cities. Now, this is a very important social change, and I will come to this. Now, let's take India, how transportation has changed. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of a bullock cart actually coming to Puttaparthi. This is crossing Chitravati. That is long, long ago. If you see carefully, there are some devotees. That is their holiday inn, if you wish. No need to make reservations. And no charges. Next slide, please. This is a horse-drawn cart called Jatka. And I have traveled many times by this in the early days. And people who used to come to see Swami in the 40s when he was in Pathamandiram would take such a Jatka from Penukonda railway station to Penukonda bus stand. From there they would come to Bukkapatnam, and from there they will take a bullock cart and come to Puttaparthi. This was it. Now, next slide, please. This is a photograph of the first train that ran in India in something like 1836 or something like that. About 150 years ago, they celebrated that. It had 3 engines, and it went from the place where the Pakistani terrorists attacked, a railway station now called Chhatrapati Shivaji, terminal. It used to be called the Victoria Terminus, somewhere there to Thana, which is a distance of about 40 miles. So, this is the improvement of transportation. Next slide is very interesting. It was taken in 1900 in South India. Here is a British Sahib and his wife, and he's driving the car. This is how the automobile looked in 1900. And there is a bullock cart staring at this. And here is, the ambient light is too much, but you see a servant of this with the caste mark of the Vaishnavas there. And this, next slide, please. I don't know how many of you realize that this plane is called Dakota. It was built in North or South Dakota during the war, I don't know where. And it was one of the sort of important carriers during Second World War. After World War, it was used for transportation extensively, first planes. It had exactly 21 seats, 7 into 3, 21. I looked inside the Dakota. And this is one of the first kind of planes by Air India, which is a private company, 1947. Next slide, please. This shows a classroom in Bombay city in the 1840s. All these are children of wealthy Parsi. The Parsis were a very enterprising community. Zubin Mehta, the famous conductor, he's a Parsi. Ratan Tata, who builds Jaguars and stuff like that, he's a Parsi. And the Parsis used to dress like Gujaratis because I don't know how many of you know, Parsis are Zoroastrians who came from Persia when the Islamic fundamentalists from Saudi Arabia invaded Persia to, convert the people there to Islam. And their religion before the Muslims arrived was Zoroastrianism. And a big group of them landed in India seeking asylum. And they went to the court of the king and said, we want to seek asylum here. And the king wanted to, they didn't quite understand the language. And he took a glass, filled it with water, and passed it on to them, saying, house full, no room. And the Zoroastrian priest smiled. He took a bit of sugar, he had sugar, he put it in that, stirred it and gave it back. Said, we don't need space, we will make the place sweet. And that was really true. They are a very small community now globally. Hardly about 500,000 Parsis are left. Most of them have intermarried and so on. And Nani Palkiwala, very distinguished jurist, who was India's ambassador to this country during the Carter administration. He was a Parsi, he came to Swami, and he was the one who gave the first commencement address or convocation address of Swami's university in 1981. He always spoke without notes, even when arguing. He was a very famous barrister. He knew everything by heart, but he had to read only once. And I read out what Nani Palkewala says about Satya, Dharma, Shanti, Prema, Ahimsa, because Swami had founded that institute based on those things. So he was explaining to the audience, do you know what Satya means? It's a word that cannot be translated in English, French, and German. And he goes on. He does this for Dharma, Ahimsa, Prema. Very beautiful exposition. And Parsi community was very forward. I talked about rural people going to cities in search of jobs. Next slide, please. This is a very impressive slide. It's a textile mill in Bombay, picture taken somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, 1860, 1870. And all these are Maharashtrian women dressed in the conventional style. Even today, 2 months ago, they brought a lot of these women from the rural districts of Maharashtra for do Seva Dal work. They were dressed exactly like this, and at night they were all gathering there after their duty was over, and one of the persons there was talking to them in Marathi about their favorite saint, Vittala, which is really Krishna, story of Krishna. And they were all listening, no change. But the point is, I'm talking about is migration from farm to cities. And next slide, please. It's again India. All these are rural people, and they are being used for construction of a steel mill. If you read carefully, I think it's 1910 or something like that. And the next slide shows a part of Bombay. I have been there in the 50s. And this was a place called Parel, and around it were a large number of textile mills, old-fashioned textile mills. And all these are textile workers and related to them. This is how this is an example of urbanization. Of course, now, after globalization, all these have been demolished, mills have disappeared, and I'm told it's a thriving IT sector. They have multi-story building, glass, air conditioning. I didn't know. I've not been there for 40 years. They said, no, you won't recognize this. It's entirely different. Okay, this brings me on to the era of globalization. If manufacture changed the world, the so-called globalization has turned it almost upside down. So I want to go through that now very quickly. This clock is not my friend, I can tell you. Next slide, please. The whole world is connected through weather. That is what I try to show. Next slide, please. The whole world is connected through transportation. People can fly from one part of the world. They don't bat an eyelid. Next slide, please. The whole world is connected through shipping, huge container ships. I don't know how many of you are aware that your ports on the west coast are being threatened. And you know by what? The changes they have made to the Panama Canal. And hereafter, the ships from China that carry goods for the East Coast won't land in Oakland or Los Angeles. They will go through the Panama Canal, and I believe in Maryland or maybe in Virginia, they are developing a port for big ships to come. So the goods to New York City will not go from LA by train or truck. They will go straight to that. That's because these containers are huge. They carry a lot of material. Next slide, please. Oil tankers. They go around all over the world carrying oil, huge amounts of oil. We don't know how much of pollution is being caused by that, but I don't have time to talk about it. Next slide, please. This is television. It binds the world. And next slide, please. This is internet that binds the world. And next slide, please. You know what this guy is doing now. I hope you have switched it off. That is what you are asked to do. I'm doing your job. Next slide, please. The iPad. So I didn't bring the smartphone because I thought you'll be tired. You say, oh my God, why does it have to tell us about what's wrong with us? Okay. From the 1980s, roughly, 75 to 80s, thanks to all these things, the nature of economic philosophy itself changed substantially. Not many people know this, But I know about this because I very carefully read a book by a professor in Berkeley, Robert Reich, who was the Secretary for Labor in the Clinton administration. He often appears on talk shows and all that. And the change that has overcome this country, and in a sense it is trying to spread to other countries, is described in the next slide. It is from bounded capitalism to unrestrained free market. There are many slides. And this is the first slide. Up to the 70s, the market was regulated. In the sense, there were federal laws. For example, trade unions existed. There were strong codes about minimum wages. And also, the taxes were very high, and so on. But at the end of it all, there was what you call a gentle slope in terms of income. Moreover, people at the rural rung of the ladders could go up. Again and again, you had any number of instances of people coming from Europe with almost penniless, landing here and going up. I remember Arnold Schwarzenegger, your governor, former governor, he's saying he left Austria just with a backpack. In those days, backpacks were not suspect. He landed, became a bodybuilder, movie star, then governor. You know the story. That is because there was a continuum from the bottom to the top and people could go up the ladder. You know, if you worked in an automobile company, you could get higher skills and go up. But all these things began to change. Next slide, please. Now, the first thing is, as the economy boomed in the 60s and 70s, the wages rise and the standard of living goes up. Even, you know, a mechanic has got washing machine, TV, color TV, and so on and so forth. The wages go up. Manufacture starts becoming more and more expensive, and profit margins begin to decline. And jobs start getting shipped overseas because it was easy to do that. You remember in the old days, when I was here in 68, the Japanese made a small inroad by sending transistor radios. It will be marked Zenith, but made in Japan. The Germans tried to explore by sending their Volkswagen Beetles. They used to make fun of it in the 50s. I was in Canada. Big truck will go just next to it just to push it off and frighten the guy. But in the 60s, the Japanese came with their first cars. And then slowly they hollowed out and everything was made in Japan, but sold in America. Now even Japan is being thrown out of business. Okay, next slide. Savings begin to decline, borrowings increase sharply, credit cards appear, creating a new and rapidly growing business. And there was a new form of money that came into existence, namely the plastic card. I mention this for a number of reasons. In the old days, I still remember when I came in the 60s, the credit card did not exist. You bought a thing only when you could pay for it, except the car and the house for which you took mortgage, and that was fair enough. But now, if I wanted to buy a thing and I didn't have money, I used a card. And many people thought, they did studies recently in schools in this country, they thought card was a cash. They didn't realize card was not cash, but something that binds you. It's dead. So here were jobs going, and people were being urged to buy more and more. And it was due to a change in the political philosophy, and Robert Reich describes it very nicely. We went from communitarianism to individualism. And in one of the talk shows I heard, one old gentleman described, when my dad came home with the paycheck, we would sit around the dining table, and my mom would divide it into 3 segments, equal parts, the cash she brought home. One was meant for the church, because the church served the community. The other was savings. The last 1/3 was for us to spend. We saved. But savings was now considered unpatriotic because you can't keep the market ticking. Don't save. Keep the market moving. Consume, consume, consume. And next slide, please. Consumption was very good for the stock exchange, the marketplace, because the GDP went, but the jobs did not keep pace. So you had the phenomenon of jobless growth. And then the middle class salaries began to stagnate and prices start going up. You may say, what's happened to you? You're talking about this country's politics, but it is tied up with ceiling on desires. It is tied up with what you call, are we born to consume or are we born for something else? I'm trying to tell you how we lost our way. And the answer is in the songs, the way back is that. So in order to realize how badly we have lost our way, I'm telling you this. So unless you know and you're frightened of losing your way, you will not go back to God. If you're not frightened, you'll say, hey, this is nice, this is illusory. So this goes on. I will just skip the next few slides and then straight away come to, let's keep a few slides. Next. Okay. Here you come to September 2008. You know what happened. Dow Jones, and then you had this Wall Street crash. And the stage for this was set in the 70s by two people. Next slide, please. Margaret Thatcher, recently deceased, and Ronald Reagan, long deceased. Both of them articulated the same philosophy. In England, Margaret Thatcher said, the business of government is to get out of the way of business. And she, unilaterally and very boldly and against the wishes of many people, introduced deregulation in a big way. There were strikes and all that. She broke up all the unions. But England began to prosper. And a very similar thing happened in this country. The telephone industry was deregulated, airlines were deregulated, and there was prosperity. There is always, once you remove shackles, there is some expansion and there is always a growth, which is expected. Because there was stagnation and you have removed the brakes. But you have to be very careful. You don't take your foot off the brakes completely. You can't throw away the brakes, which is what people are trying to do. And that produced a crash in America. It produced a crash in England also, to a point when Margaret Thatcher was laid to rest. There were a lot of programs on BBC. A very large number of people actually abused her. The Iron Lady. It was very strange because media played upon that because they have to show we are impartial and all that. She was praised in Parliament, but many people also condemned her in Parliament. I'm not here to pass judgment, but what I am trying to say is, all these growth mantras, they work for some time. The old mantra of the 50s worked for some time. The magic mantra of Margaret Thatcher has worked for some time. It has outlived its usefulness. These things, Swami used the word, adu anni shashvatam kadu. They are not eternal. Shashvatam okate. So next slide, please. This is Robert Reich, and this is the book Super Capitalism. And he says, the individual was relentlessly driven to excessive consumption by non-stop advertisement. This in turn promoted hyper-individualism. As a result, cooperation was replaced by brutal competition and compassion by extreme self-interest. This hyper-individualism is something I must talk about because young people today believe that it's all okay, I don't depend on anybody for anything, I owe nothing to nobody, including the parents. This is typified by a blog written by a young Indian working in the IT sector, and it was very arrogant. He doesn't realize that we are where we are because of the sacrifices of other people, which compels me to recall a talk given by late Mr. V.K. Narasimhan. You must all be knowing him, at least by name. He was the editor of Sanatan Sarthi for many, many years. Very distinguished journalist who has won all kinds of praise, fearless journalist. Swami asked him to talk. And Mr. Narasimhan castigated the boys. He said, all of you are studying for only one reason, you want to go to America. You're all parasites. America was built by hard work. it has come to a certain stage where it has influence. You want to just go there and ride piggyback. You must sacrifice and build this country and make it good so that Americans want to come here. That's what he said, which is true. And basically, the failure of Margaret Thatcher's thing was captured by a man called a journalist in England. Next slide shows that. There's a lot of words, but essentially he said, this man, Philip Blond, our fishmongers, butchers, and bakers are driven out, converting a whole class of owner-occupiers into low-wage earners employed by supermarkets. In short, mom-and-pop stores go, and Walmart comes. And Walmart is now trying to enter into India, and there's a big fight whether to let in or not, because we have a large number of mom-and-pop stores. If I go to, I'm very frightened because, Puttaparthi, you have old women selling bananas, flowers. All these things are corporatized. Where will these people go? They are uneducated, illiterate. Who will? We don't have social security. We don't have safety nets. Can we really afford to embrace somebody else's economic model in a country with so much diversity? Meanwhile, people in this part of the world are beginning to recognize that there is a problem in terms of social breakdown. Next slide, please. This is David Cameron, the Prime Minister of UK, and he is talking here in the last para. We need more discipline in our schools, and we need action to deal with the most disruptive families. In short, all the action necessary to help mend our broken society. What is he saying? He's saying UK is a broken society. This is not, what happened to all the progress from Margaret Thatcher's reforms? Next slide. I come nearer home. This is David Brooks of New York Times. I managed to read him whenever I can log on to New York Times. They allow you only so many free hits. I can't afford to buy it. Otherwise, I listen to him on PBS with Mark Shields every Friday, and also on All Things Considered, very tangles with EJ on. They're fascinating. He's, of course, self-proclaimed conservative, but he has got a balanced head, I should say. And he says in the New York Times date given there March 18, 2010, the United States is becoming a broken society. So the problem of a broken society is such that no country is immune from it unless it immunizes itself with proper, what you call, values. The moment you've been, in fact, in a talk given in Boston, in a Kennedy Center, I heard it on WBUR, David Brooks says, we talk of moral values, but do not have a moral substratum to sustain those moral values. And our job here is to create that substratum. No use talking about moral values. Swami said, Satya, Dharma, Shanti, Prema, Ahimsa. We have heard it. Even the dogs in Puttaparthi have heard it. That's no use. Let's get moving. Go to the second gear and see how to create that substratum. So all of society needs it. That's our task. And just to mention or bring to your attention that people in this country were talking like this. I would like to show the next slide. No country has the monopoly. There is your great president. What did he say? He says, we have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. This is in 1863. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us, and have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. So this kind of wisdom was there, words of wisdom was there. Let's go to the next slide. Teddy Roosevelt, who gave you your national parks, who believed in preserving the wilderness of the beautiful wilderness of this country. What does he say? Very simple, almost like Swami saying, one line. To educate a man in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to society. And we have in India about 100 universities that are menaces to our society, and I don't know how many for-profit colleges you have in this country. I don't want to count. You count and you have the headache. Next slide. You know this guy, tough guy, who beat up the Japs? 5-star general. What does he say? History fails to record a single precedent in which nations subject to moral decay have not passed into political and economic decline. This prospect is facing us in India every day. And nobody is recognizing the fact that India for thousands of years had a very rich moral tradition. The roots of that tree are being eaten by termites. They are spraying insecticide on the leaves. Nobody is talking about moral values in India. I feel absolutely indignant about this. We have to cry out loud, foul, and bring back the relevance of God to our society. And how have we become crazy like this? For that, I turned to Cornell University. Next slide, please. This is Professor William Provine of Cornell University. He says, he blames modern science, and I stand guilty, although I'm not a part of it. I didn't contribute much to science. Modern science directly implies that the world is organized strictly in accordance with mechanistic principles. There are no purposive principles whatsoever in nature. There are no gods and no designing forces that are rationally detectable. Second, modern science directly implies that there are no inherent moral or ethical laws, no absolute guiding principles for human society. Thirdly, human beings are marvelously complex machines. The individual human becomes an ethical person by means of two primary mechanisms, heredity and environmental influences. That's all. In other words, there is no moral law governing the universe. Gandhi said there is a moral law governing the universe. But today's intellectuals say there is no moral law governing the universe. And our intellectuals are copying the market-oriented intellectuals of this place. And this is what Pope Benedict, when he was Pope, said, tyranny of relativism. In other words, he said values are absolute. They are given by God. But today, we define values to be relative. I can change values. They are flexible. They are plastic. They are elastic. They are not. For example, if you take the censorship, our movie industry had censorship laws. They were very strict at that time. They said, no, society has changed. You have to relax. There may be a point in that according to them. But according to Swami, values are eternal. Truth is eternal. There's only one truth. 1,000 times he has said there is no Indian truth, American truth, Chinese truth, Russian truth, Pakistani truth. There is only one truth, and that truth is God. And that truth is indivisible. It's the same with all the values. So the fundamental question before us is, are values relative or are they absolute? If we believe in a God and we believe that God gave us the values, then we have no flexibility. And this question is very relevant because when I was in Manila, I was talking to a devotee group and one lady said, you know, it is not adharma if a poor man goes and steals. He has to feed his family. So this is a discussion session based on questions which were supposed to have come out of my book, which was very nicely promoted this morning. I hope you'll buy the book. I don't get any royalty, by the way, but we can pay salaries back home. This lady asked the question. So I asked her, ma'am, before I answer your question, please define who lays down the rules of dharma. Is it you and me, or is it someone else, namely God? I want to know that before I answer. If it is you and me, there is no point in my giving answer because it is your word against mine. But if you believe dharma is absolute and the rules of dharma are given to us by God, then there is a basis for me to argue because I have a reference. If it is just between you and me, you have your reference, I have my reference. We are into Einstein's relativity, and we can have our differences. But if you believe in God, then I will give an answer. Otherwise, there is no answer. You are free to make up your own rules. That's the point I am making today. That is the point that Pope Benedict made. Laws of morality are not relative. So, modern society has replaced the word with ethics, and ethics is flexible. You have an ethics expert in the New York Times who answers various questions, and you will tweak the answer according to situation. That is not possible in the case of Satya Dharma. That is simply not possible. And let me very quickly go through the next few slides. This is India, economic reforms coming into India. GDP growth goes like this. Next slide, please. This is how the software industry grew. In 2008, it was something like several billions of dollars, $87 billion. Now it's even more. Next slide, please. Now you can go to shopping malls in India. They look like this. There is a reason why I'm showing. Next slide, please. Another shopping mall in India, crowded. And next slide, please. This shows some statistics. And the total population of India is about 1.2 billion. And this is how it is tied. 16 million at the top and 684 million in 135 million households. And each household annual income is like this. It may not look much, but even by our standards, it's not much. It's low. But the real point is this. Very many people in India think India should become like the United States. My point is, India cannot become like the United States and should not become like the United States, not only for its good, but for the good of the world. Just to set the pace, let's go to the next slide. This is India in 1947. This was the population, this was the GDP, $213 billion. In 2012, our population is 1.2 billion. Our GDP is 1.8 trillion, which looks pretty good. But then the population has almost gone 4 times. America, the same, 144 million, $1.3 trillion. It was like us. By 2012, the population has just doubled, but this has gone right here. You're still borrowing. But look at India today. Next slide. You have the skyscrapers and you have all these slums. So this contrast must not be forgotten. Next slide, please. This is a picture taken in a slum called Dharavi, around which a big movie was made which won the Oscars, Slumdog Millionaire. All trash lying here. It's horrible. And next slide. This is a picture which I took when we went on Gram Seva. It shows a shop in a village. That's all the shop. He opens his door and sits there. And what he has is what you get. You can't get an aspirin tablet. So there are lots of villages in India. Even now, if you go to Puttaparthi on the road, if you look from the car, you will see shops like this. And there are other people who can shop in Walmart, shopping malls and buy imported goods and all that. What about these people? Not that they need those things, but we have to keep this in mind because this inequity creates a problem, social problem. Next slide, please. This is a village in Chhattisgarh. This is a state that adjoins East Godavari. And there's a lot of poverty there. And the next slide, please. This is the slide that I made, and it blew me off. This is a picture taken of agriculture in India in 1888. This is a picture our boys took in a village when they were covering the mobile hospital, not far from Puttaparthi. They are still plowing like that, except the people are having shirts, there are no shirts, and there's a woman who is joined it. So ladies have got more opportunities now. I want to draw a lesson from nature. Let us look at a baby as it grows to adulthood. What is the purpose of this? I'll mention. The body has different parts. And when there is growth, there is a definite way in which the different parts of the body grow. There is a balanced growth. The reason I am referring to balanced growth is I want to ask whether economic growth is balanced or imbalanced. Next slide, please. This shows how the height of a baby grows. And this is an adult. But you can't make out the point I'm trying to make. And next slide brings it out. Okay. When you have a baby, the size of the head is 1/4 the size of the body. But in the case of the adult, the size of the head is only 1/8 of the body. I don't think any of you knew this. And you see, the nature, because at each age, the body has to do different functions. So it designs the size of the various organs like this. So if you are trying to develop society, you must make sure that all segments of the society grow properly according to the way they should. But that is not being done. You are just trying to promote growth of the creamy layer. What about the people below? And to highlight this, show the next slide. The population of India is 1.2 billion right now. And of this, 450 million are in the age group 18 and below. That means the number of people we have to educate in our schools and provide jobs for is more than the population of entire United States. And you people are having struggles with your education budget. We don't have a struggle because we don't think about it. It's simple as that. I worry about it. I worry to death. But by 2030, the population would swell to 1.5 billion. India would be the most populous nation in the world, on earth. And the population of young people below 18 would be 900 million. What are we going to do with 900 million in 2030? Where are the jobs going to come from? Nobody's bothered about that. So, we have all sorts of issues like that, and they are connected with spiritual values. Just to draw attention, let me go to the next slide. This is the consumption of electricity in the United States in 2009 in terawatt hours per year. India was consuming this much in that year. But if India were to consume like the United States, we would be consuming so much. About 3 times or 4 times what you are doing. And this is China's consumption. If China were to consume electricity today, like you're doing, it will be like this. And what that means is, where are we going to get the coal? Where are we going to get the oil? India has no coal, very inferior coal, and very little oil. Everything has to be imported. We just can't try to build a society where we imitate this country. It is foolish. And yet, people are talking about that kind of thing. And I would like to take water. Next, take water. It's astonishing how much water there is on planet Earth. If you look at the oceans, they're full of water. And God has very interestingly put a lot of water, most of it in the sea, which is undrinkable. And the rest of it is ice in the Arctic and Antarctic, some of it in the ocean and some of it on land. Antarctic is huge continent covered with ice, and Greenland and places like that are covered with ice, and the mountains, Himalayas and all that. And if you take away all that, there is a running current account which is 93,000 cubic kilometers. That is all. This water goes round and round from the ocean to the mountains as rain, then comes down as river. Part of it is underground and aquifers. This is all you are allowed to use. The rest of it has been locked up by God, not available to you. So you have to be very careful. This goes in a loop. Now, the consumption of water by planet Earth has gone from 500 cubic kilometers per year to something like 4,000 cubic kilometers per year. If this goes back, there is some sense. But right now, what is happening is this amount of water is wasted. So when we draw 4,000, we are supposed to return 4,000, but we are returning only less. And that is a frightening thing people do not understand. And that has consequences. Next slide, please. This shows what is called the Gangetic Valley. This is the river Ganges emptying into the Bay of Bengal. This is the Himalayas, this is Tibet. I am showing this map for a certain reason. Next slide, please. This is a picture taken by a remote sensing satellite, Indian satellite, in 1984. You see the Ganges here and underground water here. Keep that in your mind, and let me go to the next slide. Same region 20 years later. Lot of water has disappeared. So this is a very populous area of the Indian subcontinent. And these people are going to have one mighty problem with drinking water. And let me show the next slide. This is the water consumption of US. This is the water consumption of India, as it is. Of course, our population is 4 times yours. But if we did at your rate, sprinkling golf courses, lawns, and all that, our thing will go like this, and China will go like this. I had to put a break here. And there is not that much of water on planet Earth. So, this is summarized in the next slide, but I don't want to, we can skip this. Basically, I'm saying resources of the planet are limited, we just cannot consume endlessly. Next slide, please. Okay, this shows the texture of India: rich, poor, educated, illiterate, urban, rural, employed, unemployed, urban worker, farmer. And we have different diversities: language diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity. And what has happened as a result of economic reforms? Next slide, please. So this is all the diversity I said. The poor are here. The economic reforms have benefited only the upper middle class. In other words, I showed you the body growth. The body grows, all parts of the body grow in harmony with each other. Now the economic reforms have benefited this, but not this. And that is like a storm. It's going to create a storm. So the hidden mismatch is portrayed in the next graphic, which we produce with a lot of difficulty. One part of India is in a plane. It's tied by a rope to one part, another part of India which is in a train. And that is tied by a rope to a bullock cart. Imagine a plane dragging a bullock cart. He's a bit of an intellectual. He doesn't want to say about moral values, but that is what we need. And where moral values are concerned, we have to stop being segmented and restrictive in our thinking. What do you mean by that? Next slide, please. Next slide, yes. This shows the river Ganga being worshipped in the evening. Every evening they offer arati to river Ganga. Ganga is called Mother, Ganga Mata. All along the Ganges from Rishikesh and Haridwar, right down to where the Ganges enters the sea. Every evening this is done, this arati is offered. It is shown on umpteen TV channels, web channels, and so on and so forth. Okay. That's in the evening. What do we do during the rest of the time? Next slide, please. This is the way we pollute Ganges. This is what I would call clean pollution. You know, in Benares or Kashi or Varanasi, whatever you want to call it, people come, bring the dead bodies and try to cremate it. They don't let it burn fully. They will just say, your turn is over, go down the river. And people bring pots and various other things for cremation. They dump it into the river. That is not as bad as what you are going to see in the next slide. This is Ganges there. This is raw sewage pouring out of a pipe into the river. And this happens all the way from Haridwar to Calcutta. What is the big deal in calling Ganga Mata, oh my God, Mother, and all that, and offering arati, and this goes on? And the first person who tried to stop it was Rajiv Gandhi. He was shocked. He said, well, how can you go on? And he tried to do something, but the economic forces would not allow. A lot of tanneries, business industries, they pollute Ganga like anything. We are almost helpless. How have we empowered the devil to make us helpless? That's the question we should ask. We have the power of God in us. We should be able to beat the hell out of them. But instead, it's the other way around. That is because we have surrendered our suspended our moral judgment and surrendered our intellect to someone else. That is the point I am entering with. But there is hope. Mine is not a negative message. Next slide, please. This is your own president in his second inaugural address. He says, there is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. So you got your recipe, sir. But all of us have a similar recipe. Next slide, please. There is no problem faced today that cannot be solved through the application of Swami's teachings. That is my pitch. And I stop here. Now, how do we solve problems using Swami's message? That comes in the last part, if you have the patience to wait for the last part, which is after lunch. I don't know what happens now, but I see Dr. Reddy taking pranams, so maybe something. I hope, by the way, despite the fact that this clock is unfavorable, I have been very kind to the clock and I have finished before time. Yeah. Thank you.
20 minutes.